India seems to be consuming very differently. If one looks at the data that has emerged from the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, the household spending has increased in the last decade, but the spendings on food seems to have declined. But it's not just that. Look at this data. There seems to be a more marked change in what India, both urban and rural, is eating. The spending on milk, vegetables is above the combined percentage of spending on food grains when compared to 2011. Also seen as an increase in spending for eggs, fish and meat, both in rural and urban. So this could possibly mean ability to access and purchase more nutrition-dense food. This, of course, is looking at the overarching broader spectrum. And we'll try and get into the details of it because that's where everything is. But first, let's just look at the overarching data. Let's look at the urban households, what we're looking at. Milk and milk products at 7.22%. Vegetables, cereals, egg, fish and meat, fruits. These are among the highest spending. Similarly, if you look at the rural household, and the percentage data is all with you, so I'm not confusing. You have milk and milk products, vegetables, again, egg, meats and fish, cereals, which are among the top spends for the families, for the households. But how do you look into the context, into the overall context? That's very important. Since the 1999-2000 survey, the share of expenditure on food has gradually declined, and the share of non-food items has increased for both urban and rural households. But the overall expenditure on food has declined when compared to the doubling of the household spending in last decade. Now, what does this really mean? A decline in food spending is understood as an increase in incomes, which then means having more money for other expenditures like on medical, clothing, education, fuel, entertainment, among other things. Is this voluntary? Or is this because of other factors such as inflation? That's also something that will have to be looked into. But there are also larger questions. Does India need to rethink its public distribution system? Would this data also now mean a change in the inflation basket that looks at consumer price index? And we'll get to this. We have a panel to look into all of this. And also, how should one look at all these findings with the inflation through a decade? Now, getting back to the survey findings. Monthly per capita household expenditure increased in the rural from 1,430 rupees to almost 3,860 rupees in the urban. Almost double. From 2,630 rupees in 2011 to almost 6,530 rupees. Both rural and urban, almost double, more than double in fact. Now to another important aspect that may be worrying: the growing divide between the rich and the poor. The poorest 5% and the richest 5%. The poorest 5% in India spend 67 rupees daily in urban areas and 46 rupees daily in rural areas, compared to 350 rupees in rural areas to 700 rupees in urban areas when it came to the 5% richest. This is almost 8 to 10 times more than the poorest daily expense. And this also includes, remember, the daily expenditure on different categories, from food, medical treatment to children's education, transport and clothing, for both the opposite spectrums, the poorest and the richest. And now a point that would require perspective from our panelists as well. The government has claimed that the interpretation of this data would mean inequality between rural and urban India is declining. But that's also very important to see in context of the 5% richest and 5% poorest and the divide between them. And that the urban-rural consumption divide has declined by almost 71%. These are the claims made by Niti Aayog CEO. Now let's just dive into details. We're going to go point by point and try and get the different perspectives involved. I'm being joined right now by Vijay Sardana, an agricultural economist, Tushar Gupta, political analyst, Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, senior economist, and Madhavan Narayanan, economist and senior journalist. Thank you very much, all four of you, for joining us. Vijay Sardana, let me just go over to you first. How do you look at the consumption pattern? The data that we went through, the changes in consumption that seem to be happening. How do you look at that?
See, first of all, good evening to all of you, the panelists and the viewers. See, two things which is important for us to understand. In the whole report, there is no mention of poor. So what we are classifying is that lowest consumption category we are defining as poor. But unless we define what is the cutoff level to whom you are calling poor, the whole argument that only 5% are below poverty line looks very good for a country. It's a great achievement. But what is the poverty parameter? This report is silent on that. Number two, if you look into overall parameters, definitely there is a reduction in consumption, or I will say expenditure on cereals, because that is coming from food security system for PDS, whatever we are offering to 80 crores population in this country. That impact, whatever saving you are finding from the cereal, you can see the enhanced spending on other items. So in one way, one can say that if the basic requirements are taken care, then consumer will spend on to improve the quality of food, which is also reflected in the survey. So which is logical. Third aspect, which is important for us to look at, that what is mentioned here is the amount, that what is the amount we are talking about. But there is a concern here because during the same time, if I try to develop an analogy, what happened to the quantity? We are increasing, showing the increased spending. But point is whether the quantity, suppose in 2010-11, if I was buying 100 grams, whether I'm buying the same thing 100 grams, 80 grams, or I'm buying
Absolutely.
120 grams.
That's right.
Those quantity is missing. Why I'm raising this issue? Because between 2010 and 2022-23, when this data is there, 21-22, MSP of most of the crops have actually doubled. Now, if this is the case, if I assume that whatever is doubled is having the same inflationary pressure on the consumer market, the consumption growth, if it is also the inflation is parallelly growing, then quantity intake is not increasing. It means whatever consumer is spending, his intake is same, but rupee terms, it has gone up because of inflation. And to compensate inflation, the labor salary or labor wages or people's salary have gone up. So I think this needs much more data to be very comfortable. But just at outset, if somebody says in my country poverty has gone down, it is a comforting. But to be doubly assured, we need more data.
Absolutely. Sure. Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, you know, if I can ask you this, and it's important because, you know, there's a perception which has come up after this particular data output that India's access to micronutrients is changing, it's increasing. How do you look at this, particularly looking at the context of which this data is coming, the decade that is coming in, the inflations that may be in place, and of course, the kind of choices that would be there? Do you see this as a remarkable change or improvement in terms of access to micronutrients?
Micronutrients refer to iron, vitamin A, and iodine. And there's no evidence about these three micronutrients here. The only evidence is about cereals and about food generally. So I think it's misleading to even ask a question about micronutrients. Secondly, let's just recall that this data is telling us that 10 years ago, about 45% of consumption was accounted for by food. It is now in the region of 39 to 40%. I mean, 40% has then to be compared to a Thailand where it is about 15%, or to the United States where it is 5%. So yes, it's a good thing. It is inevitable that the consumption of food should, or its share in total consumption would come down. But it's an extremely small reduction from about 45 to 40%. Next, I think in your introductory remarks, you were saying spending has increased, and you talked about some doubling of household expenditure. Well, do we know if these are current prices or constant prices? It's clear that these are current prices. And there is no mention of what the rate of inflation has been. So we don't know, in fact, if in fact, after taking into account inflation, these actually are increases. Okay, it's just talking about shares of expenditure on certain items. That's all it is saying. Thirdly, if share of food has come down, obviously share of some other items would have gone up. Fourthly, let's just remind ourselves that we have among the worst child malnutrition rates in the world. They are worse than in Africa, than a typical African country. You know, stunting rates are 35%. They are not 35% in Africa. And the global hunger index, we have gone down from a rank of 102 out of 140 odd countries to 111. Child malnutrition, undernutrition is still 35%. Body mass index of adults, 20% of adults are still malnourished. Has PDS composition to change? Yes, we've been making this case for a long time. We need to add dal to it because there's protein energy malnutrition in addition to micronutrients that I spoke about at the beginning, for which dal is necessary in the PDS. Second, oil is necessary. We are importing 70% of all our oilseed needs. We even import dal.
Right.
These should be staples. They should be part of PDS. You know, midday meals should have eggs for children. These are the ways we will improve nutrition. And let's just remember that as far as BVR Subramaniam is concerned, the claim that poverty has come down to 5%, the NSSO doesn't say this. For anyone to say that poverty has come down by X percentage or is down to X percent, you have to have a poverty line. What is the poverty line in Mr. Subramaniam's head? The Niti Aayog has no poverty line. So how has it come down to 5%? Where is this number coming from? And as far as poverty is concerned, this consumption estimate is telling us zero, nothing. The 27-page report, which I've read extremely carefully, and I have a long piece coming out tomorrow on this.
All right. Okay.
Cannot be compared to 10 years ago. The sampling is different.
Okay.
The items that are included in the list are different. The methodology is different.
Okay.
And all of this is said by the NSS itself. And by the way, I was a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics of the NSS. And the NSS themselves told me that the Consumption Expenditure Survey, when it is released, it will not be comparable to 10 years ago. So on what basis is the Niti Aayog claiming...
That's an important point that you're mentioning, Dr. Santosh Mehrotra.
Sorry?
Right. Let me just get in others as well at this point. Tushar, that's an important point you're making, Dr. Santosh Mehrotra. Let me get in others as well. Tushar Gupta, look, I mean, this is one of the arguments that is coming at the fore. Where is this survey talking about poverty? Where are these inferences being drawn about? And second important that I want our panelists to really to spend some time on, is it high time that India changes its PDS, the entire public distribution system, particularly in the light of this data that we've not had for almost a decade? Tushar Gupta?
Well, look, there are several ways one can interpret this data, but a few things stood out for me when it is about rural consumption. You might want to factor in the inflation pressures, but if you're looking at serious inflation, as the skeptics might want to claim in the last 10 years, why would the spending on durable goods go up? Why would the spending on dry fruits, for instance, which is not something you would relate to rural consumption, would go up? Why would the expenditure on toilet articles, for instance, go up? Why would the expenditure on processed foods go up in the rural areas? So, you can look at the data either which way you want, but what has happened in the last 10 years, and if you take a report, if you take a visit to the ground, especially in the rural hinterland, the Himalayan regions, for instance, there is an impact of the entire welfare programs that have been running for a decade now. You start with the PDS distribution system, which I think should be in place for at least another 5 years before we can really start tinkering with it. Of course, you want to change how it's constituted, maybe more nutrients, more cereals. That's a different debate altogether. But you look at the overall impact. You have an 800 million to 1 billion aspiring population that wants to spend more. It wants to spend more on processed foods rather than cereals. It wants to spend more on durable goods. It wants to spend more on electronics, for instance, as evident by the numbers that keep coming out from several companies. So you have an aspiring population in the hinterland now, and these numbers also to some extent reflect that. Now, if you want to debate poverty, if you want to debate how the metrics are being calculated, I say a simple solution. Just take a trip to the ground and see how different the consumption is for FMCG goods, if nothing else. That's a good litmus test. Look at how rural India is now looking at FMCG goods. That can be a good litmus test for you. And again, what stands out for me in this report is the expenditure increase on durable goods almost going up by 40% in the last 10 years, going from almost 4.85 percentage points to 6.89 percentage points. So I think that's something very remarkable.
All right. Madhavan Narayanan, see, there are two spectrums to this, but the heart of this entire issue is just one thing, and that's really something that's concerning me. Is the average Indian, are the children in our India, are the women in our India, are Indian citizens able to access better food and better necessities? Is there a change that you can see, or is this just data in isolation? Do you see anything to this?
Well, let me begin by saying, Sneha, good evening, that this is not a data in isolation, but we cannot party with this data, if I may say so. You can't read too much into it, but let me look, instead of getting too granular, let me look at the broad trends. I think there is a reasonable assumption that the Niti Aayog is making, which is that the share of food products in overall expenditure has come down for the country as a whole, and more so in rural areas. And the reasonable assumption behind this is that as people earn more, they do consume food, but the share of food comes down, which basically helps them do more with their disposable income. Inflation is certainly a factor, but if you look at the fact that India has grown by 7.5% compounded every year in GDP right since 2011, for the past decade, and it basically means it's not a rocket science to say that poverty has come down. Okay, the real question is how much has it trickled down, and nobody is talking about inequality, which is a very important aspect of this debate. If the rich get 10 times richer and the poorer get only 5%, better, it is true that poverty has come down, but the gaps have also gone up. That's one thing for us to ponder about. As well as the women,
this
children...
is an important point, and I want both of you, Vijay Sardana as well as Madhavan Narayan, to talk about this. Madhavan Narayan, you touched upon a very important thing, and it was very interesting for me. I don't know the nitty-gritties of this because I'm not an economist, but I expect both of you to draw inferences into this. The Niti Aayog CEO has actually claimed that inequality is decreasing. How does that come into the picture?
Actually, this is First of all, this consumption expenditure is not sufficient enough to understand inequality. Inequality includes study of wealth accumulation. That has not been properly done. That doesn't come into the NSSO. How much people have accumulated by way of wealth and income and savings doesn't figure in the NSSO data. So it only tells you a very small portion of the picture in terms of consumer goods, industrial goods, and food products. So whereas actually the real question is if 7.5% GDP growth has been there for a decade now, how much of the share of that income has gone to the poor, which is where people like Dr. Mehrotra are correct. We can interpret it in many ways in terms of technical methodology and stuff like that. Mota moti, as they say in Hindi, overall rural consumption of food products has improved. It's a fact that people are consuming non-cereal products more. Food, vegetables and milk and eggs and all. This is definitely a good step in the right direction. But also, I would like to point out something which is not part of the debate. A lot of this money might have come from urban employment, leading to remittances to rural areas, to families, which increases consumption levels. This doesn't mean rural employment has gone up necessarily. Okay. So there are nuances to this from various perspectives we can take. We can slice and dice the data. But it is certainly something that has happened, but this is part of growth economics. The point is, my own assumption or my contention has been that India's problem is no longer poverty, but inequality. In fact, that we are not even measuring the Gini coefficient. Nobody knows what is the Gini coefficient of the Indian economy. It hasn't been measured except by World Bank about a decade ago. So it only shows that you're not even looking at the data where you should be if you're actually progressing as a country. Now, let me complete. This whole business of
even as you're making this statement.
Sorry? Hello?
No, even as you're making this statement, I'm just reminded of what the CEO has said. He's actually spoken about the Gini coefficient going down.
Yeah, but
I mean, just to say what you were saying, I don't know where that comes from.
This is not, I haven't seen that data. I haven't seen the point is that let me look into the details again to see if I missed something. But Gini coefficient is not even part of the conversation, everyday conversation of Indian economy. And that is something I'm concerned about. But I agree with the Niti Aayog in terms of the fact that there has been a secular increase in consumption. All people will agree on this, except that the inflation factor mentioned by Dr. Sardana and Dr. Mehrotra is also important. But the question is, I'm worried about certain things. Sneha, let me complete this. We need a more progressive measure of inflation, because if disposable incomes lead to more people buying jewelry or buying mobile phones, it's not necessarily progressive. We need a more development and environmentally conscious inflation index, which doesn't exist. In fact, most economists are still using broad macroeconomic parameters to understand development. We have the Human Development Index, but we don't have an inflation measurement matching the human development perspective. So this is for something like Dr. Mehrotra for people like Dr. Mehrotra to think about. We need a whole new narrative to be spun around progressive development as opposed to simple macroeconomic growth.
Okay. Vijay Sardana, India is witnessing farmers' protest. It has witnessed farmers' protest over the last several years, for that matter. One thing which is very interesting is, if you look at the MSP issue, now much of these aspects, the comparisons that we saw is not covered with MSPs. You don't have horticrops that are covered with MSPs. You don't see dairy that's covered with it. So, I mean, now would the MSP, does the Indian agricultural sector, do the farmers in India require a totally different prism for MSPs? I mean, what they are fighting for, is it even minimum of what is required for them to be able to fuel what India requires?
See, MSP debate is a very different debate than what we are doing today. Even if you look into the calculation of MSP, even if I go with the CACP data, the cost of production of paddy in Punjab is 841, whereas the cost of production of paddy in Maharashtra is about 3,200. Now, how you will compare that? And if you go by the formula of cost of production plus 50%, then argument is that Punjab farmers are shouting that they are not getting the right price. Let me give you live data. 841 is cost of production. With the 50% over, it becomes something about 1,260 rupees. MSP is 21, 23.
No, but Vijay
They are
Sardana, what I'm
getting
trying to
almost-
understand is,
That's
do
what I'm
we
coming
need a
to.
different prism? Do we need a different prism to look at MSPs now? I mean, you will talk about formulas, it will not, it will not go down with most of our viewers like that.
No,
But do we need a different prism from a layman's
No,
perspective?
I'm coming to that. See, what is the benefit? You have to understand that where the whole approach of MSP is defective. You are talking about cost plus 50%. It means the cost will go up every time you have to increase the MSP. Means 50% margin has to go up. It means you are compensating or encouraging inefficiency and higher cost of production to have the retail price of the product, which is unfortunately bad for any economy. That's what I say that Dr. Swaminathan formula is highly defective. We have to rework on it, number one. Why dairy farmers are not shouting? Because they are directly talking to consumers on a daily basis. Whenever the cost of production goes up, dairy cooperatives adjust their production and market prices accordingly so that farmer is compensated and consumers are also not too much burdened, because if there is an inflation, cost of production goes up, it is compensating both. On one side farmers, on the other side not becoming too prohibitive for consumers to consume. That is the right way to look at it. Now, unless we have a holistic view, only talk about MSP and MSP without understanding the logic and market economy when consumers are anyway paying much higher than MSP. Problem is, it is not reaching the farmer. There is a big black hole in the process which people are not willing to address because of their own vested interest, because of their own, I will say that, agenda in the game, and they only want to encroach upon taxpayers, that is government funding and subsidy. This is what is sad part in the whole debate of MSP. Otherwise, we have to look into farmers' concerns. We have to see that farmers are better off, because biggest poverty is in rural India, especially the small farmers. And unfortunately, those poor small farmers do not have marketable surplus. So when you increase MSP, they never get benefit. The only people, those who get benefit of MSP is either the large farmers and the commission agents, because their commission is linked to the percentage. So as soon as you increase the MSP, their percentage commission goes up without doing anything. So this is a sad part, and that is why always behind the scene you will find rich farmers coming in cars, tractors and everything. For protest, you will not find poor farmers. Only you will find either aged farmers sitting at the border funded by big people and commission agents.
Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, when you look at what has emerged out of this data, do you see this being interpreted in the right sense in terms of how India is consuming? Do you see, with how the government is talking about these interpretation of data, is it largely politics at play, or are there economic insights that the government is really practically looking into, or are these political narratives that are being spun? Because Madhavan Narayanan was talking about, he was not agreeing with anything of what the CEO seemed to have claimed, and so did you. So where do the economists meet on this then?
No, the economists don't have to meet with BVR Subramaniam, Sneha. I don't see any reason why we need to meet with
no, on the data,
on the CEO.
On the data.
Yes,
sir.
yes, on the data.
Sure.
He's misinterpreting the data to suit the government narrative. It's very simple and very straightforward. I said so that first, there is no poverty line there. You cannot estimate. Sardana also said this. There is no poverty line. How are you telling us that it's, poverty is down to 5%? What is your poverty line, for God's sake? So I'm sorry, with all due respect to the CEO, I mean, he shouldn't be making statements that he doesn't know very much about. Secondly, let's just come back to the real issues. This discussion was not supposed to be about MSP. This discussion was supposed to be about the Consumption Expenditure Survey. And please note that the Consumption Expenditure Survey 27, there are all 27 pages of it is full of tables which are based on shares. It's all the analysis is based on ratios and proportions. The absolute values of in rupees, there is no interpretation put on it, and there should be no interpretation put on it, because it is inappropriate. because there is no inflation adjustment rate being used to deflate the values of 2000 to the values of 2023. So it's meaningless to compare across time. And for that reason, additionally meaningless to talk about this in terms of poverty. So, the NSO consists of statisticians who know what they are doing. They have not made any exaggerated claims. It's all about, oh, ye badh gaya aur wo ghat gaya. And honestly, as far as ye badh gaya, wo ghat gaya, the only good news is food is down from 45 to 40% on average in the country. And honestly, that's way too little a reduction for us to satisfy ourselves that, people are being able to spend on other things. Just two other points. The growth rate since 2014 has been 5.7% and not 7.5%, which it might be if you include 2011. Secondly, there is plenty of poverty in this country, and inequality is not the only issue. Inequality is a huge issue, but the World Inequality Report told us in 2022, and its segment on India, 4 words about it, very pithy and very telling. What were the words? India is a poor and very unequal country. And let me tell you how poor it is, because I've got PLFS data in front of me, Sneha, which should shock every one of your listeners. Workers
Yes, we have actually done an entire discussion on this. Please go ahead, sir.
Now, workers who earn less than 100 rupees a day in wages in 2018-19 were 31%, and in 22 they were 33%. 100 rupees a day of the entire workforce of 500 million people, and their numbers rose from 152 million with wages less than 100 rupees a day to 180 million. I have the numbers estimated from the PLFS. And for those who earn a wage of 101 to 200, that number went up from 141 million to 152 million over that same period. Okay. And that's an additional 24-25%. If we don't call to less than 200 rupees a day of wages as less than poverty line, then I don't know what is poverty, honestly. We are an extremely poor country.
Okay. All right.
Bullshit.
Compounded by inflation. And just because 200 million people are doing nicely, thank you very much, and laughing their way to the bank, doesn't mean that the vast majority are not suffering.
Tushar Gupta, I'll come to you, Tushar Gupta.
60 million people went back to agriculture in the last 3 years. Get the facts right.
Okay, Dr. Mehrotra, I have to interrupt you. Madhavan Narayanan is raising his hands.
Yeah.
Right. Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, I'm totally out of time. Madhavan Narayanan, a minute to you, and I'll have to allow Tushar Gupta to make the final comments. And I'll have to give him a little more time because I gave quite a bit of time to Mr. Mehrotra. Madhavan Narayanan, to you.
3 very quick points without disagreeing with Dr. Mehrotra, who's making some interesting points. Your graphic has a technical mistake, which is actually a Freudian slip. That graphic says poverty plates and pallets instead of pallets. So pallets is about what you eat, pallet is about what you paint. And to me, it's very symbolic of what the Niti Aayog has done. It has taken, it has painted, it has given a colorful interpretation to very limited data. And therefore, if you go into a larger resource of wealth accumulation and income generation overall in the economy, and one thing that the NSSO brings out is that the consumption levels of rural farmers who are self-employed people hasn't grown up much, which is probably explains the unrest. Very quick point, this debate is not on MSP, but I have to disagree with Mr. Sardana because the MSP is not just about wheat. We need a long-term roadmap to manage everything from millets to vegetables to milk, and then run it through farmers' cooperatives, which itself, Prime Minister has himself spoken about, so that their fear of big business-driven retail is taken away. We need an approach there. But simplistic interpretation of farmers being riding tractors is highly unethical, in my opinion.
All right.
And last but not the least, let me say
Okay,
that
Mr.
this is
Tushar.
an opportunity. We should simply start measuring wealth and not merely consumption.
You know,
Sure,
Sneha,
sure. Points
Sneha,
absolutely taken, Madhavan Nayan. Tushar, please go ahead.
You know, it's always a pleasure to be on your debate, Sneha, but it's rather unfortunate that few economists of yesteryears, in order to stay relevant, want to declare on national television that India is a poor country. Just because the economists are so stuck up in theory, they do not want to
No,
understand
you
the
can't make this
realities on the
personal.
ground.
No, Mr.
No,
Tushar,
it's
you
not
can't make this
personal. My
personal. You
problem-
can't make this
my- no,
personal.
Sneha,
No,
Sneha,
all four of you
Sneha,
are my
how-
guests. I'm not going to allow you. No, I'm not going to allow you to take barbs
are
at each
okay with
other.
anyone making
That's
this
not what
claim
I
that
allow on
country
my
is
show,
poor?
Tushar. But please
So,
go ahead
Sneha,
with your
you're
point.
okay. No,
I'm not allowing
you
that.
are okay.
Tushar, please
Every
go ahead with your
BJP
point.
wala
You are
Please
okay.
go ahead with your point.
becomes personal the moment they don't have substance.
Sir, please shut up. Sir, please shut
No,
up.
Tushar, please go
Sneha,
ahead
you're
with
okay
your point.
someone. No.
Please go ahead with your
No,
point.
Sneha,
I
you're
would
okay
allow
with someone
barbs
trying
or jibes at our panelists. I would
See,
allow
I'm
that
sorry.
here.
I'm sorry.
Everybody
I'm
is
also
free
not
to
going
make
to
their
sit
points,
here.
please.
Everybody's free to make their points, but everybody, in order to stay relevant, cannot say we are a very poor country. We are a very poor country. The
Go
economist
ahead,
is not
Tushar. Make your
ready
point.
to
Make your
factor
point.
in the
Counter them with
realities.
the point, please, Mr. Tushar.
I'm telling you the realities on the ground. Are you not looking at the deposits in the Jan Dhan accounts? Are you not looking at the expenditure on the durable goods? You're talking about inflation. You're talking about the wages going down. Yet the expenditure on other articles is going up. On dry fruits is going up. On fruits and vegetables is going up. On processed foods is going up. You do not want to counter this simple fact by saying that, "Arey, aap wages ka baat kar rahe ho," then how's the consumption of durable goods going up? And over that, you sit and shout, "Arey, we are a poor country. Arey, we are a poor country." How
All
do you
right.
expect anyone to take this nonsense?
Okay. All right. All right. We are totally out of time. Tushar, you have made your point. You have made your counter. Our whole point of doing this discourse is trying to understand the different paradigms and prisms to understand this data that has come out. Hopefully, we are leaving our viewers more equipped. Thank you for joining us. Time for a short break.